In the annals of European royal history, few figures embody the catastrophic consequences of dynastic inbreeding more completely than Charles II of Spain. Known to his contemporaries as El Hechizado, the Bewitched One, this Habsburg monarch represented the ultimate failure of a genetic strategy that had dominated European royalty for centuries. His reign and tragic life offer a compelling case study in how the pursuit of political power through concentrated bloodlines could produce consequences far more devastating than any external enemy. The Habsburg dynasty's approach to marriage had been methodical and ruthless in its pursuit of power concentration. For generations, they had adhered to a strict policy of endogamous marriage unions between close relatives designed to keep wealth, territory, and influence within the family structure. This practice, while politically advantageous in the short term, created an increasingly narrow genetic foundation that would ultimately prove unsustainable. Charles II emerged from this system as perhaps its most tragic victim. His genetic heritage represented the culmination of 2 centuries of deliberate inbreeding, where marriages between uncles and nieces, cousins and cousins, had created a genealogical web of unprecedented complexity. His parents were uncle and niece, as were both sets of his grandparents. The mathematical probability of genetic diversity in his lineage had been systematically eliminated through generations of calculated matrimonial decisions. The physical manifestation of genetic damage. The most immediately apparent consequence of this genetic concentration was Charles's severe mandibular prognathism, commonly referred to as the Habsburg jaw. This condition, which had appeared in various degrees throughout the Habsburg lineage, reached its most extreme expression in Charles. His lower jaw protruded so dramatically that normal oral function became impossible. The alignment of his teeth was so severely compromised that his upper and lower rows could not meet, creating a permanent gap that rendered normal speech and eating extraordinarily difficult. Foreign diplomats and court observers consistently remarked upon the shocking nature of Charles's appearance. His inability to close his mouth properly left him in a constant state of apparent bewilderment, his jaw hanging open in a manner that undermined any attempt at royal dignity. The practical implications of this deformity extended far beyond mere aesthetics. Every meal became a complex logistical challenge requiring specially prepared foods that could be consumed without normal chewing. Palace kitchens were forced to adapt their entire operation around the king's inability to process solid food normally. The speech impediments resulting from his jaw deformity created significant diplomatic challenges. Charles's attempts at verbal communication produced sounds so distorted that even native Spanish speakers within his own court required significant effort to decipher his meaning. Foreign ambassadors found themselves in the peculiar position of needing interpreters not for language translation, but for basic comprehension of their host monarch's utterances. His physical abnormalities extended well beyond the famous jaw deformity. Charles's overall body development reflected the systemic nature of his genetic damage. At full adult height, he barely reached 5 feet tall, but his proportions suggested something far more disturbing than simple short stature. His head appeared disproportionately large for his frame, supported by a neck so weak that it seemed inadequate for the task. His limbs displayed a skeletal thinness that gave him an almost spectral appearance, while his torso appeared compressed and hunched. Perhaps most remarkably, Charles did not achieve the basic milestone of walking until his 8th year. This extraordinary delay in motor development reflected the comprehensive nature of his physical disabilities. Even after achieving bipedal locomotion, his movement remained unsteady and required constant physical support. Palace records describe his characteristic gait as a lurching motion from one piece of furniture to another, using walls and chairs as stabilizing aids throughout his adult life. The spinal curvature that plagued Charles created a permanent hunched posture that became his defining physical characteristic. This deformity not only affected his appearance but likely contributed to additional health complications throughout his life. The visual impression he created was that of a man carrying an invisible but tremendous burden, which, in the context of his genetic inheritance, proved to be remarkably accurate metaphorically. Cognitive and emotional consequences. The genetic damage that manifested so dramatically in Charles's physical appearance had equally severe implications for his intellectual and emotional development. His cognitive abilities remained at a level more appropriate for a child well into his adult years, creating enormous challenges for the basic functions of monarchy. Literacy, typically achieved by noble children at an early age, eluded Charles until his 10th year, and even then represented a significant struggle rather than natural development. Court tutors faced the impossible task of educating a monarch whose intellectual capacity seemed fundamentally limited. Their reports describe attempts to provide instruction as similar to pouring water into a vessel. With holes, information could be introduced, but retention and comprehension remained elusive. This educational challenge had profound implications for governance, as Charles struggled to grasp even basic concepts of statecraft and administration. His emotional regulation remained similarly underdeveloped throughout his life. Palace servants documented episodes of violent tantrum behavior that would have been concerning in a young child but proved terrifying when displayed by an adult monarch with absolute power. These outbursts, characterized by screaming, physical thrashing, and complete loss of behavioral control, would alternate with periods of complete withdrawal where Charles would become entirely unresponsive to his environment. Even his hair growth reflected the systematic nature of his genetic damage. Rather than the full, healthy growth expected of a young adult, Charles's hair appeared in thin, patchy distributions that fell out regularly, leaving his scalp with an appearance more reminiscent of disease than normal male pattern changes. Court artists faced the challenging task of creating official portraits that maintained some semblance of royal dignity while working around physical realities that defied conventional representation. The progressive nature of Charles's condition became increasingly apparent as he aged. While most individuals reach physical maturity and maintain relatively stable health through their prime years, Charles experienced continuous deterioration. His already compromised system seemed to be failing at an accelerated rate, creating a situation where aging brought not just normal decline, but active systemic breakdown. The succession crisis and marital failures. The most politically catastrophic aspect of Charles's condition was his complete inability to produce an heir. A failure that would ultimately trigger one of Europe's most devastating conflicts. The genetic mutations that had so severely compromised his physical development had also left him functionally incapable of reproduction. His sexual organs remained in a state of arrested development that physicians of the era described as essentially infantile. His first marriage to Marie-Louise of Orleans represented a diplomatic alliance of enormous importance, bringing together the Spanish and French royal houses. However, the reality of the marriage proved to be a disaster from the wedding night onward. Palace servants later testified to Marie-Louise's distressed emergence from the royal bedchamber and Charles's apparent confusion about the entire proceedings. The same genetic factors that had created his physical deformities had also rendered him incapable of normal sexual function. The Spanish court's response to this crisis revealed the political desperation surrounding the succession question. Rather than acknowledging Charles's biological limitations, court physicians and advisors focused their attention on Marie-Louise, subjecting her to a series of increasingly invasive and humiliating medical examinations. She was forced to consume various herbal preparations, undergo painful medical procedures, and endure constant scrutiny from a court desperate for an heir that her husband was biologically incapable of providing. The psychological toll of this situation on Marie-Louise was devastating. Historical accounts describe her transformation from a vivacious and intelligent young woman into someone increasingly withdrawn and depressed. She spent significant portions of her time in prayer, desperately seeking divine intervention for a biological impossibility. Some historical analysis suggests that the various treatments and medications forced upon her may have contributed to her mysterious death at the age of 26. Charles's second marriage to Maria Anna of Neuburg represented an even more desperate attempt to resolve the succession crisis. By this point in his life, Charles's physical condition had deteriorated further, and his new bride's private correspondence reveals her horror at her husband's appearance and her growing realization that producing an heir would be impossible. The court's increasingly frantic attempts to address the situation included consultations with physicians from across Europe, examination of ancient fertility texts, and even experiments with various magical remedies. The medical examinations Charles endured in these attempts were profoundly humiliating. involving detailed physical inspections of his reproductive organs by multiple physicians who were attempting to find some medical intervention that might restore function. These efforts failed because the fundamental problem was not medical in the conventional sense, but rather the result of genetic damage so severe that normal biological function had become impossible. Meanwhile, the political implications of Charles's childlessness were becoming increasingly apparent across Europe. Foreign courts were well aware that his death without an heir would create a succession crisis that would inevitably lead to military conflict. The War of Spanish Succession was already being planned in diplomatic circles, with various European powers preparing their claims and military responses for Charles's inevitable death. When conventional medical approaches failed to explain or improve Charles's condition, the Spanish court turned increasingly towards supernatural explanations and religious interventions. The Catholic Church provided a framework for understanding Charles's condition that seemed to make sense within the context of 17th-century religious belief. He was possessed by demonic forces that had been placed within him through witchcraft. Father Froilan Diaz, appointed as the court's chief exorcist, declared that Charles harbored multiple evil spirits that required aggressive spiritual intervention to remove. The exorcism ceremonies that followed were extraordinary both in their intensity and their public nature. Rather than being conducted privately, these religious rituals became theatrical spectacles held in the throne room itself, with nobles and foreign diplomats forced to witness their monarch writhing on the floor while priests shouted Latin incantations over his convulsing body. The exorcism process began with Charles being forced to consume holy water mixed with ground religious relics, a concoction that immediately caused violent illness. The king would vomit uncontrollably, shake with convulsions, and sometimes lose consciousness entirely. Father Diaz interpreted these physical reactions as evidence of demons fighting against the holy substances, rather than recognizing them as natural responses to consuming contaminated liquid filled with bone fragments and other unsanitary materials. These ceremonies could continue for hours, with Charles subjected to increasingly aggressive physical manipulations as priests attempted to literally wrestle demonic forces from his body. Crucifixes would be pressed against his skin until he screamed in pain, holy water would be splashed over him repeatedly, and he would be forced to recite prayers in Latin despite his limited intellectual capacity, making comprehension of the language extremely difficult. The exorcism campaign expanded beyond Charles himself to encompass the entire royal palace. Father Diaz became convinced that the building itself was cursed, leading to a systematic purification effort that resembled a combination of spring cleaning and supernatural warfare. Servants were ordered to collect every item that might potentially be contaminated by witchcraft, including personal belongings of previous queens, gifts from foreign courts, and even pieces of furniture. These objects were transported to the palace courtyard and destroyed in massive bonfires while priests chanted exorcism prayers over the flames. The most disturbing aspect of this supernatural intervention was Charles's apparent belief in its effectiveness. His limited mental capacity made him highly susceptible to suggestion, and when priests assured him that demons were being expelled from his body, he would experience temporary psychological relief from his constant physical suffering. This created a destructive cycle where Charles would desperately request additional exorcisms whenever his symptoms worsened, seeing them as his only hope for improvement. The exorcism campaign reached its culmination in 1699 when Father Diaz claimed to have successfully identified and expelled 47 distinct demons from Charles's body. Each demonic entity supposedly had a specific name and was responsible for different aspects of Charles's medical condition. The marathon spiritual assault required to achieve this supposed victory left Charles so exhausted that he collapsed into unconsciousness and remained unable to speak for 3 consecutive days. The final revelation, autopsy findings. When Charles II finally died in 1700 at the age of 38, the Spanish court faced a moment of terrible scientific truth. After decades of claiming their monarch was cursed by supernatural forces, they now had the opportunity to examine the physical reality of what had actually existed inside his body. The autopsy performed by Dr. Jerónimo de la Fuenteperola produced findings so shocking that the official report was initially suppressed as too disturbing for public consumption. Dr. Tyrole's examination revealed internal abnormalities so severe that they seemed to confirm every supernatural fear that had been whispered about Charles during his lifetime. The royal physician's report described a body that appeared more monstrous than human, containing organs so malformed and diseased that his survival to age 38 seemed medically impossible. Charles's heart presented the first shocking discovery. Dr. Tyrole described it as no larger than a walnut, shriveled and blackened like burned meat. Considering that a normal adult heart weighs approximately 300 grams, Charles's heart appeared to weigh less than 50 grams. The organ was so small and damaged that physicians marveled at how it had been capable of circulating blood throughout his body for nearly 4 decades. His respiratory system proved equally horrifying upon examination. The lungs were described as corroded and gangrenous, filled with fluid and what appeared to be rotting tissue. The smell emanating from his chest cavity was reportedly so overwhelming that several medical assistants were forced to flee the examination room. The condition of these organs suggested that Charles had been slowly suffocating throughout his adult life. The abdominal examination revealed perhaps the most disturbing findings. Charles's intestines were described as putrefied and gangrenous, essentially decomposing inside his living body. His digestive system had been failing catastrophically for years, which explained many of the eating difficulties that had plagued him throughout his life. The reproductive organs that had caused so much political turmoil were revealed to be catastrophically underdeveloped, confirming the biological impossibility of his ever producing an heir. The examination of Charles's skull provided the final piece of the medical puzzle. When physicians opened his head, they discovered that his brain was surrounded by an abnormal accumulation of fluid, a condition now recognized as hydrocephalus. The brain tissue itself appeared damaged and discolored, providing a clear explanation for his intellectual disabilities and erratic behavioral patterns throughout his life. Dr. Tyrole concluded his medical report with a statement that sent shock waves through European courts. "It is a miracle this body sustained life for so long, as it contained not a single healthy organ." This medical assessment was so extreme that it actually reinforced supernatural beliefs rather than dispelling them. The evidence seemed to suggest that only dark forces could have sustained life in a body so thoroughly damaged. Historical consequences and legacy. The death of Charles II without an heir triggered exactly the continental disaster that European diplomats had been anticipating. The War of Spanish Succession erupted immediately, as various powers moved to enforce their competing claims to the Spanish throne. This conflict lasted over a decade and resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties across Europe, making it one of the deadliest wars in European history up to that point. The tragic irony of the Habsburg story is perfectly encapsulated in Charles II's life and death. A dynasty that had spent centuries obsessively controlling marriages to concentrate political power ultimately lost everything because their final monarch couldn't perform the most basic biological function required to continue their lineage. Their genetic purity strategy had created a ruler so damaged that he was incapable of the fundamental act of reproduction necessary for dynastic continuation. Charles II stands as perhaps history's most compelling example of how the pursuit of absolute political power can be undermined by biological realities. The Habsburg obsession with maintaining bloodline purity through systematic inbreeding created increasingly severe genetic problems with each generation, culminating in a monarch whose very existence seemed to defy natural law. The medical understanding of Charles's condition, revealed through his autopsy, provides modern observers with clear evidence of the devastating consequences of sustained inbreeding. His case offers valuable insights into genetic inheritance patterns and serves as a stark warning about the biological limits of human reproductive strategies designed purely for political advantage. The story of Charles II ultimately demonstrates that sometimes the greatest threat to absolute power comes not from external enemies or internal revolution, but from the biological consequences of the very strategies employed to maintain that power. His reign represents the final chapter of one of Europe's most powerful dynasties, brought low not by military defeat or political upheaval, but by the inexorable laws of genetics and human biology.